explains why we managed to get so far as we did with compliance and regulation. It opens the door for many things that we can do, various different fiat-backed assets, because we're operating offshore. So because we have this regulated USD stablecoin, we can also facilitate domestic payments. I personally foresee, other large stablecoins, not USDT obviously, but USDC, for example, being forced to be domestic. Because once you start getting into offshore transactions with USD, the MSB licenses start to come in, and one-to-one regulation is kind of enforced. So I'm hopefully you guys can see that the first white paper we had was a page, maybe 2 pages. It didn't really explain anything. So when we started to get politicians, and large capital firms coming to us and saying, "Hey, can we use this for X, Y, Z? We really want to use this within our own ecosystem, for example," because a lot of people really underestimate regulation. But the more partners that we spoke to, the more exchanges, the more we've been speaking to the businesses about integrating USDV, we can see the use case, and we can see the trust that comes from these other regulated firms, for example. We wouldn't have been able to get a great partnership like PVCom Bank if it wasn't the regulation checkbox that we answered. So I guess, does anyone have any questions really about the white paper? I'm more than happy to delve into any answers.
Hey, Warren, how's it going? And again, thanks for taking the time to talk. I had a quick question, kind of about the whole overarching Davitia ecosystem that the white paper references. Can you explain how that ecosystem exists within the current investments that Vamanti already has in companies like Fund and Elon, and how they'll be deployed utilizing those companies?
Sure. So that's actually a pretty good question. Thanks. So Davitia is more like a code name. We didn't really have a set name for it to explain the ecosystem, and referring to multiple different things like USDV started to get a little bit confusing. So if you remember many moons ago, when we first started announcing, Vamanti's step into this space, one of the things that we discussed was the interest yield generating. So Vamanti's investments, not just into Vietnam, for example, because that's one of our target countries for adoption, but Vamanti's investments into own companies, or anything that involves spending abroad, or essentially with this remittance channel. The ecosystem play is essentially allowing USDV to kind of fuel machine of these various different products. So, for example, when we take the reserve of USDV and deploy it to an entity that Vamanti has a controlling stake in, we can ensure the safety of those funds. So we don't want to distribute to like Nexo or Nexus, for example. They use users' funds and essentially, as like a financial instrument. What we're aiming to do is use it as a financial tool. They're pretty much, similar vehicles. But essentially, these companies loan out that reserve to trusted businesses, those that have a history of repaying credit. And then they pay essentially a fee to the USDV reserve, and then we pass that along to users. And obviously, this interest rate fluctuates with the various different ecosystem plays that we have. But the main one being the country of region where those investments operate. So it's much easier for us to manage a Forex float, for example, with the remittance channel. It's much easier for us to push various methods of spending in the region. Vietnam, as we've discussed in the past, has an extremely high rate of adoption, not just with cryptocurrency, but with privatized banks, private e-wallets, private services. The people of the region don't have the most trust in the government's infrastructure. They're more likely to adopt a privatized entity. So for us, it makes a lot of sense. We've got a lot of experience in the region. We've got a lot of networks that we can leverage. Everything just kind of fits into place, really, of where you want to launch a product like USDV. So it just kind of made sense as it ticked the boxes of familiarity, network leverage, and then applicable use case. So yeah, just in that particular example with the loan companies, it really comes down to the reserve. There are some new Vemanti investments, which are pretty exciting, that USDV will come into play, especially in relationship with PVCom Bank. So PVCom Bank are actually interested in offering various banking services via a private entity, and especially using USDV. It means the bank can offer services that no other bank in the region does. They can essentially launch credit services with a privatized fund, if you like. So allowing users to use USDV to open a credit line, it doesn't, you don't actually have to, there's less regulation approval in the region, basically. So there's a whole wealth of benefit for the bank as well. And obviously we get to push adoption, which is, our main focus this year. So yeah, I hope that explains a little bit more about about why we chose Vietnam and why USDV kind of plays into the ecosystem.
Yep, totally got it. I was curious also to know, when you were kind of like introducing the call, you're talking about like these other players, being intrigued by USDV and like wanting to look at the white paper, things like that. Is the DeVita network ecosystem going to be exclusively within entities that Vamanti has a stake in, or is there the potential for it to extend beyond entities that Vamanti is directly involved with?
So use case wise, anyone can essentially just adopt USDV. We're working with some other we're working with some partners that are focused more on DeFi products that we can't necessarily have our own stake in. So it makes much more sense for us to just work with these entities, kind of separately. Mutual benefit, social contract areas, and whatever you want to call it. There's always a way for USDV to be offered. Wherever there's whenever there's USD being spent, whenever someone needs to transfer something of value from one person to the next, there's always a case for USDV, right? But in the beginning, when we essentially want to loan out USDV to a company to earn interest, that's pretty much, at the moment, we're only really focusing on entities that Vamanti has a controlling stake in or a decent chunk of equity. At least some sort of operational control at the board level. The reason for this being is we don't want to mess about with USD funds, the USDV reserve, for example. So it's very important to us to return those funds back with an interest. At the moment, the only way that we can proceed doing that 100% securely is by loaning it out to Vamanti-owned operations, or at least entities that we have a controlling stake in. Yeah, the main reason for being is just trust. We just don't want to risk like a liability or an asset being unable to be paid. It's very important for us to make sure that we have control over those funds 100%. In the future, as we grow, we may be able to partition a small chunk of USDV for more high risk, high reward operations or investments, etc. But that's not really. That would maybe be next year or the year after. It's kind of a separate service that we want to offer. But at its core, it's only going to be not in terms of adoption. In terms of adoption, we're already having discussions with PVCom Bank and various different retail outlets on the ground in Vietnam, and we're already attracting a small user base of companies in the US that want to send USD to Vietnam much more securely, much cheaper, much faster, much more transparent, for example. So that's already happening. But just in terms of the interest yield, it's only going to be to Vamanti, owned entities in the beginning.
Cool, thank you.
How about everyone else? Did you guys take a peek at the white paper? Pretty quite cold today. So I'm really excited that you guys have had a chance to get the white paper. I know you guys have been on my case for a while, but hopefully that you can see why we've managed to take our time with it. There's a lot of language issues that we had to compete with, I guess, with the legal team, and obviously from a stand of regulation, we had to make sure our applications with the compliance boards were kind of managed properly. What they didn't want to happen was we would be releasing documents that was very different from a bunch of the forms that we've already had to file for compliance. So it's been a bit of an uphill battle. There may be some things change, over the seasons, but for the meantime, nothing should be edited too much. The main people that were going to be reading this were essentially leaders of large cap firms, obviously the regulatory and compliance guys, even some politicians that were inquiring about how USDV can solve some real use cases for remittance. This is why whenever we see people on the internet arguing about compliance for crypto, or whether they're killing innovation or something, it's why we've always supported regulation. There's a lot of bad players out there. There's a lot of financial instruments that seek to take advantage of users. So from Vamanti's case, we want to eliminate a lot of these bad players. Not only are we a regulated entity entering the space compared to everyone else that's trying to fight against regulation to become regulated, we have a pretty good solid use case being a stablecoin. We're 100% not security. The value doesn't rise. There's a few things with how we can market it, especially to US soil. So I appreciate a lot of your guys' patience in why we've gone through like a silent period and that kind of stuff. But I'm really excited to have this white paper out. Yeah, it's been a long, it's been a hard working season, but I'm very happy. What do you guys think? Was there any interesting parts that stood out to you? Was there anything that you didn't necessarily agree with? If you've got any opinions, feel free. Please let me know.
One thing that caught my eye that I thought was, I don't want to say funny, but kind of interesting, was, so I follow Franklin Knoll and Andrea Lipkin on LinkedIn and stuff, and those guys seem to be obsessed with the idea of a crypto banknote. So my understanding is in the white paper you guys talk about crypto banknotes. Is a crypto banknote basically like physical cash that is tied to some sort of cryptocurrency, and is that something that you guys are actually going to deploy out, or like what is that all about?
Well, if you look at its core, a crypto banknote is essentially just a tokenized banknote, right? So there's many applications of banknote, for example. It could be a credit line issued by the bank, it could be a bond, it could be a various different financial instrument, really. But essentially, at its core, is just a tokenized cash equivalent. What you look at the CBDCs, the main purpose of those is to be a government stablecoin. That's pretty much what it is. But as we've said from the beginning, there's always going to be an applicable use case for privatized stablecoins. If we only had government banknotes, or if we only had authentic banknotes, I guess we wouldn't have private services like credit cards or holiday insurance, or there's so many different applications of a tokenized banknote. People essentially, what was cash backed by many years ago, essentially gold. So when we tokenized gold, did that become an equivalent banknote? So it's a great question, to be honest. The reason that those are obsessed with a crypto banknote is essentially that is the next form of that is the next evolution of money. We've been a digital economy now for what, at least 10 years, maybe 15 years, arguable. And back then, with the birth of credit cards came a very cashless society. And then if you look at WeChat over in China, you know, people don't necessarily even use cash anymore. Everything's everything's done by the phone. Everyone pays by WeChat or Alipay. So for us, you know, it was how does Vemanti fit in this space? There's a gentleman that used to work for the Pentagon quite recently who I think he's quit his job. Some of you guys may have seen that. Whose argument is essentially that you know, China's already won the war, so we have to be looking at China, you know, as their progression. If they already have, you know, a 20-year lead on digital currency, and their adoption with everyone in the country is, you know, extremely high. I don't think there's anyone that doesn't use WeChat Alipay, to be honest. You know, the majority of the citizens essentially use digital money in e-wallets. If they have that big of a jump, you know, we have to look at why the West isn't being able to keep up. We've tried to implement Apple Pay in stores. We've tried to implement what's it called, like Android Pay and these other kind of digital wallets. And you know, we're only just starting to have what is it, the tap pay, where you just tap your, you know, your bank card with the, is it the NFC, the chip at the back. You essentially just, you know, if we can only just get that adoption, you know, we're not really focused on Apple Pay or these kind of digital e-wallets. There has to be an alternative. So essentially, if these stablecoin payments don't essentially take off, the West is too far behind to catch up. But I think we're reaching the breaking point of essentially the youth market that's demanding these services. I know Apple Pay is quite prominent in a lot of places in the US, but in Europe, for example, everything's either chip and pin or tap and pay. There isn't really any digital currency that a user has on their phone that they continue to pay with. So that's really the battle that we have, is the adoption of digital currencies. That's why our focus hasn't been on international payments, essentially in the form of, you know, a person visits another country and they have to use another form of payment. However, in Vietnam, not only can we, you know, use our ecosystem partners essentially to push out a lot of these plays, the crypto adoption rate is phenomenal in the region. People are adopting e-wallets. We've been speaking to a few of them actually about integrating, maybe possibly trying to offer a coinciding remittance service next to their digital e-wallet in partnership with PVCom Bank and a whole other bunch of PVCom Bank services. Not to say that that won't be in our own suite of applications or services, but trying to build out these partners in Vietnam makes a lot of sense because of the adoption. So the reason that back to the question, sorry, that I'm rambling on, back to the question of what you were saying, with Franklin Knoll, etc., being obsessed with digital banknotes, it's because it's the next evolution of money. So we've been working on this for, what, 2 years now? 1 year in stealth, and then essentially, you know, close to a year of being more public and open with you guys to see what we're pushing out there. One of the reasons for that is because we need to attract the support of you know, the community, because then we can take this to various you know, DeFi services, various staking partners, etc., and say, look at our community, you know, 100% organic. You guys can you know, essentially see how much demand we have for USDV. So that's why when people go and check the network for USDV and check the blockchain transactions and stuff, a lot of our stuff has been offline transactions, because that's the only way for digital cash to essentially take off. You know, if we operated 100% of the test transactions on the blockchain, it would get very messy very quickly. You know, the blockchain network that we deploy on isn't necessarily built, or we haven't exactly integrated it to handle the payment side. We've only handled it to be the minting and kind of the operating Genesis network. So when we migrate to the other blockchain networks, it's much easier for us to manage, you know, mass payments at extremely low cost. And we're really happy with how it's gone so far. So back to the sorry, I keep rambling. So back to the original question of the purpose of the digital banknotes. It's essentially to replace cash. So Vietnam is a perfect region for it. I hope I answered the question. I hope I didn't skirt off too much. There's a lot to discuss on that one.
No, yeah, I thought you did a great job answering it. And kind of going back to Franklin Nolan, Andre Lipkin, is one of the things they talk about the greatness of cash that needs to be kind of carried over into crypto banknotes is the idea of being able to transact anonymously. I mean, with like credit cards and that kind of stuff, you're kind of tracked and your spending is known by your issuer and things like that. So, in like a USDV crypto banknote world, uh, is there a way for like retail transactions to be anonymous still, or is it always going to be like attached to an individual's account?
Uh, well, let's take for example a film like Blade Runner, right? In Blade Runner, it's pretty much a cashless society, right? Um, Everyone that uses credit, there's still nefarious and black market activities that use credits. I'm not comparing it to a fictional story. I've got a point, but it kind of plays on the suggestion that I said that every single currency is, they're going to want a privatized stablecoin. One of those is because people may want to operate with, nefarious activities, or they just want to remain anonymous for, a variety of other reasons. So with a privatized stablecoin, we don't have the control or the power to monitor everyone compared to a CBDC, right? Whose sole goal, let's face it, is to have a government's eye on a cash flow. So they want to be able to track a dollar from the minting right through to the destruction. So what we essentially do is, sure, we have a KYC account for users. But for anyone that takes the USDV out of the ecosystem, obviously there are gas fees involved. A user can set up their own wallet. We don't have necessarily the purview to monitor those transactions and determine the KYC. But we can determine the KYC for users within our own ecosystem. So we hope to offer both services to people. We don't obviously condone nefarious activities, but because we have a small element of centralization, at least we can monitor the individual, smart contracts. So the individual USDV tokens in a wallet. We could blacklist that wallet. We can try to freeze them as much as their off ramp as possible, to secure, a user's funds that were essentially stolen or being used in a blatant disregard for like AML policy, for example. So there's always going to be a reason why people want a privatized, cash alternative or service, for example. There's many other, KYC free methods out there. We don't condone it. We like regulation. So yeah, I mean that's essentially my reasoning. There's always going to be people out there that want an alternative to, a government issued asset. And USDV, fits that role perfectly. We are compliant. We don't condone dangerous activities. However, if someone wishes to remain anonymous, they certainly can, withdraw from our ecosystem and use alternative rails. There might be a different set of costs with that. There might be obviously higher risks that we can't manage or maintain. But it's all up to the individual user. 100%.
Got it. Thanks.
No worries. I appreciate the question, mate. Does anyone else have any questions? I'm more than happy to fire away.
Hey Warren. So you actually kind of mentioned something that seemed pretty interesting to me around the whole idea of payment solutions. So I know currently the way that stablecoins work is that it allows you to kind of transfer money from one user to the other, but in regards to payment solutions, and I know that you mentioned that's not something you're entirely focused on in this implementation, is that something that you can envision kind of like further down the line, and like what that would look like? Or is that something that you guys aren't necessarily considering at this time?
At the moment, it's just the retail payment services, as in an individual going to another country. So we're actually quite focused on payments in Vietnam. To excuse me. We're actually focused on payments in Vietnam. So, between two domestic users. So essentially Tan's vision since the very beginning was he wants to say, how can the small sandwich roadside stall, how can she accept USDV, right? As soon as we make it more accessible to the individuals without a bank account, without having to store large amounts of cash for the day, for example, that's when we've essentially, that in his eyes is adoption. When we make it much more accessible for street food stalls, or taxi drivers, or essentially anywhere that you would necessarily have a very small cash payment. So we're actually very much focused in driving that adoption over in Vietnam. What we're not necessarily focused on is international travel. I mean, for obvious reasons, right? But for international travelers that need to have a foreign currency, they arrive in another country and they're like, okay, how do I get funds out? If TransferWise had QR payments, that's pretty much how we're trying to envision USDV in Vietnam, right? Essentially on the ground, being able to transact very easily between two users of the same platform.
Right.
Ideally, with this relationship with PVCom Bank, this is what we're aiming to drive with a lot of their regulation and compliance licenses, but also their large user base. So we're immediately able to tap into PVCom Bank's users, those that are looking at it as a financial tool. And then
Right.
with the Vietnamese stable coins on the ground, we can partner with those to offer essentially a one-to-one swap of essentially the two varying assets. So this can help us manage the forex reserve on the ground as well. I mean, I couldn't even tell you how many people in Vietnam, at least half, use stable coins. One of them in the region has over 1% of the population, which is over 1 million users. So this is a fantastic springboard for USDV and Vamanti to essentially jump off as we launch in the region and kind of retain users. We've got PVCom Bank for the traditional finance side, and then we have various stable coins, OTC desks, agents, etc., that we can partner with on the crypto side. So we're in a very, very good spot between the two to look at payments.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. In my limited understanding of how international currencies work, like I mainly just kind of focused on this as like a peer-to-peer transaction, but I kind of forget half the time that Vamanti does actually have those relationships with bank partners, so that they can kind of like get their or get the vision of peer-to-peer, but also like in a larger space of like having multiple people in that transaction or in that ecosystem where they can do the transaction. It's kind of difficult for me to understand because I don't normally pay through cryptocurrencies, but I definitely understand how it's an evolving market of cashless transactions. So yeah, I was just kind of like curious to see like what the plans were around driving it beyond just peer-to-peer and including like a larger base of the network of transactions. So yeah, you definitely explained it pretty well. Thanks.
Nice one. I mean, yeah, any time that people essentially pay with Venmo or Cash App or even just with a card, users don't care about the individual transaction. They just care, has it been paid, right? They don't care about the method. They don't care about the technology in the background. If I have a friend in another country and I'm sending him $50, or if I'm trying to pay for something abroad when I'm residing in my home country, I just care about, do they have the transaction? Am I protected? Am I able to file a chargeback if the merchant doesn't deliver, for example? They're mainly the key questions. We don't really have many people when they make a payment say, oh, am I going to use wire, ACH, or Plaid? But in foreign countries, especially with a distrust, I would say, of government infrastructure and banks, this is partly probably what PVCom Bank are essentially hoping to offer, an alternative line of services to users that is obviously in demand. Otherwise, PVCom Bank wouldn't be, investing. And they're extremely eager to get us operational over there. So it's going to be really exciting, the things that we deliver. PVCon Bank have some pretty crazy ideas that we didn't even think possible. So it's going to be really interesting to see that the payment scape in Vietnam change this year as more people kind of come out of lockdown, because they had a pretty heavy lockdown the past few months. So it's going to be really interesting to see how digital payments take over that kind of cash payment space. But until someone manages to crack the extremely small scale, and we're talking transactions of like, 10 cents every second almost, multiple transactions of a few cents per second. Until someone is able to crack that, like USDV and Vemanti, for example, that's the only barrier to the space. A lot of people in the West, are thinking of transactions of a few dollars, maybe $5 for a Starbucks, maybe $4 for parking or whatever. But in Vietnam and these unbanked, underbanked regions, it's very much so, a case of a couple of cents being charged for, food items or groceries or service payments, for example. So that's probably why a lot of larger crypto players haven't looked at Southeast Asia as they should have. I mean, the partnerships that we have now with this remittance channel is just kind of the phase one to help bring money back to the Vietnamese region, and obviously we can monetize that.
Right.
I mean, every year I think it's like is it 18 billion? I'm sure it's 18, probably higher now because of the COVID pandemic. But it's an $18 billion remittance channel. So even if we only got 1% of that, the $180 million is pretty good. Pretty good monetization strategy, to be honest. So that's just one of the monetization features. So if we can capture several different payment features, P2P payments, not just the international remittances, then we're talking about a whole other different monetization strategy. So the potential is there, and we're just really lucky to have all of the kind of ecosystem partners that we can leverage from the existing network to kind of make things like this happen.
Yeah, I agree, and I would say that shareholders are equally as eager to see the launch of this. So, looking forward to it for sure.
Yeah, hopefully Dan's been kind of reining in a lot of the kind of craziness in. There's a lot of things that Daniel can explain that we can't, and there's a lot of things that Daniel knows how to portray that we don't. So I think he was definitely useful. I just really appreciate your guys' patience, really, because I'm sure a lot of the time you guys thought that we were just ignoring, or we were just we didn't want to reply or anything. But it's always a case of we can't. We have to be, especially as we're going through this period now. We have to be very careful with what we say, which one of the reasons why Tam was in a silent period, for example. We just don't want to bring problems later on. But with these calls, essentially we can have a very informal chat where we can, discuss the project in a what you call it, in a safe space almost. I don't really want to use that word. But yeah, I appreciate you guys checking out the white paper. Any other questions, guys?
I just have one quick last question. So I was reading somewhere that apparently in countries like Vietnam and other countries in the region, apparently it's not possible to hold USD in bank accounts. Do you see holding USDV potentially facing issues, or no? I guess it's not considered currency technically; it's considered an asset. Like, I guess what's your thoughts on that situation there?
James coming out with the wiki questions today, definitely trying to trip me up. Fantastic. No, I really appreciate it, mate. So yes, there's a few things really that separate USDV from USD. One of them is we don't consider ourselves a cryptocurrency, so there's no real regulation there. We are definitely classified convertible virtual currency. It's essentially, one-to-one. It's a representation of the currency. So there's a different set of laws really that Vietnam looks at. Even though they say it's illegal for people to own USD, everywhere in the tourist spaces around Saigon, even in some parts of the countryside, 100% they accept USD, right? They'll ask you the price if you go into barter in a market or something, and they see that you're a a foreigner. They'll essentially just ask USD or VND. So it's a very common practice for people to use a dollar. They get given a small amount less of the change as like a fee for accepting the because obviously the USD needs to be converted at some point. But it's not, I wouldn't say, illegal. I mean, it might just be more of a framework law kind of thing. But transactions in USD, especially in gold shops, for example, I mean, gold shops are essentially, money exchanges. Like in a pinch, you can always run into a gold store and swap out some foreign cash for domestic cash. And in multiple countries, this has always kind of been the way. But in Vietnam, there's a lot of gold stores, a lot of them. So another kind of alternatives of the way that we're setting up as terms of a digital currency. Vietnam, they classify it as different assets. If Vietnam turns around and say we class you as a cryptocurrency, there's not really much that they can do to stop us because it's against the kind of constitutional right of citizens to invest. Even mainland China say, we can't stop you investing in cryptocurrency projects. Despite what the headlines say, it's a fundamental law of China to allow people to invest, which is a much more communist constrained country than Vietnam, which heavily relies a lot on capitalism for the GDP growth, et cetera, et cetera. So they would never turn around and stop people being able to invest in an asset. So they couldn't really make it impossible for citizens to hold USDV. What they could do is essentially stop USDV being the only thing that they could do would be to stop USDV being paid for services. So it's illegal to pay for something in Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or that kind of stuff, but it's not illegal to hold it. It will never be illegal to hold it. So what it makes more sense is with a partner like PVCom Bank, once we have USDV in the region, we essentially just have a representation of that USDV in the form of a VND account. So a user would still be able to store the USDV in their account. They can still use various different financial services, opening a credit line, for example, paying for stuff internationally. And then we would essentially just use the reserve of PVCom Bank to handle those transactions. So the only thing it would stop our users from doing would essentially be less bloat on the network, I guess. So that's the only thing that I envision would change in the form of regulation, but it's extremely highly unlikely. Just because these kind of things do happen. In terms of people transacting in foreign currencies and foreign trade and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's it.
All right, cool. Thanks, Warren.
I really appreciate the questions, James. Like some fantastic ones being fired out.
I like to think I do some research, but thank you for answering them. I appreciate it.
If some of you guys haven't seen the Slap the Ass podcast as well, James recently had me on a couple of weeks ago to discuss USDV in the region. Excuse me. So feel free to check out Slap the Ass on YouTube. I think we'll be doing another one in a couple more weeks, where we can give you a bit more of the technical updates as we release the next wave of progress. In regards to the USDV white paper, does anyone have any other questions? All right. I apologize for jumping on late this morning. Really appreciate you guys being patient and holding tight. Yeah, if anyone has any other questions of the white paper, I'm more than happy to schedule another call next week. I didn't really want to give too much on the updates because then there wouldn't be much to, didn't want to kind of repeat myself a lot of the times on the call. So I just wanted to keep this one really about the white paper. But if we have more people with questions, feel free to fire them in the group. If I haven't replied to you in DM. Just keep sending a bump, keep sending a hi. Just did you see the message? Like, I promise you, I will get back to you. Just as the community grows now, there's obviously a lot more questions that I've got to fire back on. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys joining. Very much appreciate you reading the white paper and giving feedback. If you guys have any other suggestions, again, feel free to just send me a message and keep firing it. Thanks very much for your time, guys. I really appreciate it on this Monday morning, or wherever you guys may be. But yeah, have a good night. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Warren. Appreciate it. Have a good one.